Secretary of Defense is announcing a top military commander who is in charge of the U.S. Southern Command is retiring now unexpectedly. Remember, this is the region, of course, where those escalating attacks against boats in the Caribbean, those boats off the coast of Venezuela that the Trump administration has said have narco-terrorists on board. We're just getting in a statement here from the Admiral, writing in part, "It's been an honor to serve our nation, the American people, and to support and defend the Constitution for more than 37 years. Secretary Hegseth says Admiral Alvin Halsey will retire at the end of this year. It's not clear why it's happening now, but it's coming, of course, as the president is stepping up that military campaign in the Caribbean, not just on the boat strikes you're seeing here, but as we reported right here last night with those authorization of the CIA operation inside Venezuela.
Okay, so what just happened at a Marine Corps University meeting in December 2025 is completely unheard of. And honestly, it might be the biggest public split between military leadership and a sitting president in recent American history. We're talking about a top U.S. Navy admiral, Admiral Alvin Halsey, who directly challenged President Trump to his face in front of other military leaders and basically called him a shame to everyone who wears a uniform. This wasn't some private talk that got out later or some carefully written statement through official ways. This was a face-to-face clash where a high-ranking military officer openly criticized the president's decisions and words in the strongest possible terms. And here's where it gets even more crazy. The clash apparently got so intense that Trump was physically taken out of the meeting, which is just a wild image to even think about. The President of the United States being walked out of a military meeting after being put in his place by an admiral who's had enough of his reckless behavior and politically driven military operations.
Senior military analyst, retired Admiral James Stavridis, former Supreme Allied Commander. It's great to see you, Admiral. In addition to being former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, you also spent years with U.S. Southern Command, years working on issues related to this region and Venezuela included specifically. On that admiral retiring, what do you make of it?
Very strange. Hard to come up with an analog. Closest I can come up with maybe 20 years ago, another admiral, Admiral Fox Fallon, stepped down from a role at U.S. Central Command because of disagreements with the administration about how to approach Iran. But extremely rare to see a combatant commander, particularly in the middle of military operations, walk away from the job.
Admiral Halsey had been dealing with growing frustration over Trump's approach to military decision-making, particularly around these controversial boat strikes in the Caribbean that have been making headlines and raising serious legal and strategic questions. Trump has been pushing for aggressive military actions against suspected drug trafficking ships near Venezuela, and he's been making public statements about these actions that military commanders see as reckless, legally doubtful, and potentially harmful to U.S. interests and military morale. The specific incident that seems to have been the breaking point was a second deadly strike on boats that Trump and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth ordered despite concerns from military lawyers and field commanders about whether the strike was justified or legal under international law. Admiral Halsey wasn't just some random mid-level officer raising concerns through proper channels. He's a senior Navy leader with decades of experience who has commanded ships and operations and who understands both the strategic and legal sides of military action. When someone at that level decides to openly confront the president and call out his behavior, it's not a quick decision or an emotional outburst. It's a deliberate choice to break with normal military rules and chain of command respect because the situation has become so serious that staying silent would be a betrayal of their oath and their responsibility to the troops under their command. The fact that Halsey felt pushed to take this bold step tells you just how bad things have gotten in terms of civilian and military relations under Trump's leadership. The specific words that Halsey reportedly used, calling Trump a disgrace to military service members in his pursuit of power, are incredibly strong and represent a complete rejection of Trump's fitness to serve as commander-in-chief. Military officers are trained from the very start of their careers to respect civilian leadership and to stay strictly out of politics, even when they disagree with decisions made by elected officials. The entire structure of American civil-military relations depends on officers setting aside personal opinions and following lawful orders from the chain of command. For a senior admiral to break that norm so publicly and so boldly suggests he's reached a point where he believes Trump's conduct has crossed lines that can no longer be accepted or ignored in the name of keeping traditional military discipline and respect for civilian authority. The news that Admiral Halsey is taking early retirement following this clash adds another layer of weight because it shows he's willing to give up his career and walk away from the Navy rather than keep serving under Trump's leadership. Military officers at that level don't retire early unless they have strong reasons. They are typically deeply committed to their service and missions, and they've spent decades building their careers and reputations. The fact that Halsey would rather retire than keep serving suggests he's reached a point where he believes he cannot, in good conscience, carry out the kinds of operations Trump is demanding, or that he's been pushed out as payback for speaking up, or some mix of both. Either way, it represents a big loss of experienced leadership at a time when the military needs smart commanders who understand both strategy and law. The wider context of the Caribbean boat strikes is key to understanding why this clash happened. Now, Trump has been pushing an aggressive approach to fighting drug trafficking that involves using military force to destroy boats suspected of carrying drugs, even when those boats are in international waters, and even when there are questions about whether the information identifying them as drug boats is reliable. Military commanders and lawyers have raised concerns that these strikes might break international law, might kill innocent people who happen to be on boats wrongly identified as drug carriers, and might create diplomatic problems with countries in the region who see these operations as violations of their sovereignty. But Trump and Hegseth have apparently been overruling those concerns and ordering strikes anyway, putting political messaging about being tough on drugs ahead of legal and strategic considerations. The White House's response to the boat strikes has been to defend them as lawful and necessary. But those defenses have been weakened by reporting that shows internal disagreement within the administration and military about whether proper legal review was done before approving deadly force. When you have senior admirals like Halsey publicly breaking with the president over these operations, it becomes much harder to keep up the claim that everything was handled properly and that all relevant commanders were on board with the decisions. The public split between Trump and military leadership reveals the reality that these operations were controversial from the start, and that Trump pushed them forward over the objections of people who actually understand the legal and operational details involved. The comparison to other moments of civil-military tension in American history is useful here. We've had presidents who clashed with generals over strategy. Truman firing MacArthur during the Korean War is probably the most well-known example, but those conflicts typically played out through official channels, with the military officer being removed from command for disobedience. Not with public clashes where the officer calls the president a disgrace before being physically walked out of a meeting. The very public and personal nature of this clash represents a breakdown in the normal processes that are supposed to manage disagreements between civilian and military leadership in ways that protect both civilian control and military professionalism. When those processes break down completely and you get explosive confrontations like this one, it signals that the relationship has fallen apart to a point where normal functioning of the national security system becomes extremely difficult. Trump's reputation for not handling criticism well adds another layer to this story, because you can imagine how he must have reacted to being called a disgrace by an admiral in front of other military leaders. Trump has consistently shown throughout his career that he sees any criticism as a personal attack that must be met with full force. And he has particular sensitivity about his relationship with the military because he sees military support as key to his political image and his self-image as a strong leader. Having a senior admiral publicly reject his leadership and question his judgment hits at the core of how Trump wants to be seen. which probably explains why the clash escalated to the point where Trump had to be removed from the meeting. He likely started attacking Halsey personally or making threats rather than taking the criticism professionally. So let's dig much deeper into what the Caribbean boat strikes controversy is really about and why it created such intense friction between Trump and military leadership that it led to this unprecedented confrontation. The basic situation is that Trump decided he wanted to use military force against drug trafficking in the Caribbean as part of his wider approach to immigration and border security, seeing drug smuggling as connected to the chaos at the southern border that's been a central focus of his administration. But instead of working through existing law enforcement channels like the Coast Guard and DEA that have set protocols for stopping drug boats, Trump apparently wanted dramatic military strikes that would make headlines and show what he sees as strong leadership. That preference for show over substance is what created the conflict with military commanders who were being asked to carry out operations that might not be legal or strategically sound. The specific legal concerns that military lawyers raised about these boat strikes focus on several different areas of international law and U.S. law that govern when and how military force can be used. Under international law, you generally can't just attack vessels in international waters without either permission from their home country or a clear basis under the UN Charter like self-defense or Security Council approval. Drug trafficking, while obviously illegal, isn't typically considered a valid reason for military strikes in the same way that an armed attack or immediate threat would be. So when Trump was ordering strikes on boats suspected of carrying drugs in international waters near Venezuela, military lawyers were rightly concerned that these operations might break international law and could expose U.S. personnel to potential prosecution or damage U.S. credibility when we criticize other countries for similar violations. There are also serious questions under U.S. domestic law about whether the president can approve military strikes for law enforcement purposes without proper approval from Congress. The Posse Comitatus Act limits the use of military forces for domestic law enforcement. And while these strikes were technically outside U.S. territory, using the military to enforce drug trafficking laws in ways that would normally be handled by civilian law enforcement agencies raises similar concerns about turning law enforcement into a military function. Congress hasn't passed an approval for use of military force against drug traffickers, so Trump's legal authority to order these strikes is doubtful at best. Military commanders who are being asked to carry out these operations have valid concerns about whether they're following lawful orders or whether they're being asked to take part in illegal military action that could expose them to legal consequences. Rather than pausing to conduct a full review and address the concerns that had been raised, Trump and Hegseth apparently approved another strike in what appears to have been a deliberate move designed to signal that they weren't going to back down or be held back by legal concerns from military lawyers. That kind of pushing forward in the face of serious legal and operational concerns is exactly what responsible military commanders cannot accept because it puts political considerations ahead of the safety of troops and the integrity of military operations. For Halsey to see that second strike approved despite all the concerns that had been raised about the first one must have been the moment when he decided he couldn't stay silent any longer. The wider pattern of Trump pushing for military operations that are politically driven rather than strategically necessary is something that's been worrying military leaders throughout his presidency. Trump sees military force as a tool for showing strength and getting positive media coverage, not as something that should be used carefully and sparingly when real national security interests are at stake and when other options have been tried. That basic difference in how Trump sees the military versus how professional military officers see their role creates constant friction and disagreement about when and how force should be used. Officers who push back against operations they see as reckless or unnecessary risk being labeled as disloyal or weak, which creates huge pressure to go along with questionable decisions rather than raising concerns through proper channels. Reports from the New York Times and other news sources about Admiral Bradley facing serious heat over these boat strikes give us a clearer picture of the pressure top military leaders have been dealing with. Admiral Lisa Frenchie, who leads the Navy, along with other senior Navy officials, have apparently been trying to handle things by carrying out the strikes that Trump and Hageth ordered, while also making sure proper legal checks and planning were done. But that careful approach fell apart when Trump kept pushing for faster and more aggressive action before proper review could be finished, and that is exactly what caused the breakdown that led to Hawley's very public clash. The long-term consequences for the all-volunteer military are also worrying because recruitment and retention depend heavily on maintaining public trust in military leadership and on soldiers believing they are being led by capable commanders who will use them properly and legally. When potential recruits and their families see stories about military leaders being pushed out for raising legal concerns and about a president who ignores military advice, it makes military service less appealing and makes it harder to bring in the high-quality people that a professional military needs. The military is already facing recruitment challenges in some areas, and this kind of political controversy only makes those challenges worse by linking military service with a chaotic and dysfunctional administration. The bottom line is that Admiral Halsey's clash with Trump at the Marine Corps University meeting represents a turning point in the relationship between civilians and the military that exposes serious problems with how Trump handles military leadership and decision-making. The fact that a senior admiral felt pushed to publicly call the president a disgrace and then take early retirement rather than keep serving signals just how badly the relationship between Trump and military leadership has fallen apart. The boat strikes controversy that triggered this clash reveals a pattern of Trump putting political considerations above legal and operational concerns, overruling military advice, and pushing out commanders who raise legitimate questions. The consequences of this dysfunction will be felt for years through damaged military effectiveness, weakened international relationships, and reduced public confidence in both the military and the presidency.